In a quiet, wooded hollow outside the hills of Vermont, in an old, slightly leaning, one-story farmhouse with a weathered shingle roof, Margaret Anderson lives alone. She is 68 years old. When spring rolls around, wild fiddlehead ferns pop up behind her house. And come autumn, Margaret digs turnips and carrots from her small backyard patch. It's a modest, peaceful way of living. She's quietly kept for many years. Once upon a time, Margaret worked in the local elementary school cafeteria. She wore a crisp white apron and kept her hair tucked under a neat scarf, always moving with care and purpose, even in the chaos of a busy kitchen. No one else diced onions or peeled potatoes quite as gently, or took as much pride in making sure every dish was wholesome, every meal lovingly prepared for the children, brightening their faces at lunchtime. When Margaret was 50, her husband Bill passed away after a long illness, leaving a quiet stillness in their home and an ache Margaret kept close to her heart. She raised her only daughter, Susan, entirely on her own from then on. Through every hardship, Margaret never raised her voice or wavered. She led by example, showing Susan a silent kind of strength, one built not from complaining, but from carrying on. Don't run up debts. Don't be a burden. You only really need what you truly need, nothing extra. That's how Margaret lived. Now, Margaret's main income is Social Security benefits, about $1,050 a month. It's not a lot by any standard, but with the vegetables she grows herself out back, plus a few staples, rice, beans, some flour and coffee from the nearby co-op, it's enough. Sometimes, when fabric is left over from one project or another, Margaret hand-stitches little gift bags or mends her old clothes, turning worn shirts into aprons or pot holders. Quiet handiwork keeps her busy, along with the odd crossword and tending to her modest garden. All the while, her heart is turned toward Susan, her daughter many miles away, and to Susan's little boy, her only grandson. Margaret's thoughts still drift back to Susan's wedding. She remembers the moment Susan, dressed in white lace, suddenly squeezed her hand while the preacher spoke and whispered, quietly but clear, "Thank you, Mom." That was all it took. Margaret felt tears roll down her cheeks, big and silent and true. That's the moment, Margaret later said to herself and to Bill's memory as she knelt at the unadorned pine shelf in the living room where she keeps family photos and Bill's old watch, that I finally felt I'd done right by her. Like I was truly her mother all the way through. Now, Susan lives in a condo complex in the Maryland suburbs, close to the city, with her husband and their young son. They call each other a few times a month, short, practical conversations. But even those quick chats are enough for Margaret. "How are you today, Mom? Are you eating all right?" Just that one sentence can light up Margaret's whole day. She's rarely invited to her grandson's recitals or soccer games, but when Susan emails over new snapshots, Margaret prints them and tucks each one into a corner of the shelf with the family mementos. My, how he's grown. She finds herself murmuring that more and more, gazing at those pictures with a peaceful, bittersweet look. There's something gentle but also deeply poignant about the way she stares. A glimmer of quiet longing always there. You know, being a parent means you carry your children with you. No matter where they go, even when you can't see them, you hear their lives in the wind, feel their laughter down the phone line. When Margaret laughs and says things like that, you can see how she's become just a little smaller, maybe a bit frailer in her shoulders. Yet there's still a solid strength inside, steady as always. Most important of all, Margaret truly does feel happy. At my age, I have just about everything I could ask for, she thinks, and believes it. But her gentle routine begins to shift one summer, thanks to a letter that arrives, quietly but unmistakably unsettling Margaret's days. She can't quite speak of it to anyone, this strange ripple in her heart. Last summer, on a hot afternoon when the crickets throbbed in the woods and the air was thick and shimmering, Margaret's phone rang. Unusually, it was Susan on the other end. "How are you, Mom? Truly, are you doing okay on your own?" Hearing Susan's voice, Margaret couldn't help but smile. "Oh, I'm fine. I'm up with the sun, tending to the garden. The cucumbers and eggplants are exploding this year. I can't use them up quickly enough." Margaret's laugh was light, almost cheerful. That's good, I'm glad. But then? Susan's voice suddenly softened. Mom, do you, have a little wiggle room? I mean, are you getting by all right on just your Social Security? There was a pause. Margaret turned quiet for just a moment, then gathered herself and answered. I'm really okay, Susan. I'm used to living simply. I never splurge on anything. I hardly spend anything at all on vegetables every month, you know. That's good then. Neither of them said much more, and the call ended after just a few minutes. But after Margaret set the receiver back in its cradle, a small, troubling uncertainty lingered in her chest. All these years, Susan had never asked her that, not once. Had something happened to Susan? Is she all right? That night, she sat cross-legged on the old braided rug in her living room, a piece of half-stitched linen in her hands, trying her best to thread her needle, but the tip kept slipping out of the fabric. For the first time in ages, she simply couldn't focus. From outside, distant thunder rolled softly over the Vermont hills. A week slipped by quietly. Then, one morning, Margaret found a letter waiting in her battered old mailbox. At the end of the drive. The return address was Susan's. It had been a long time since Susan sent an actual letter, and Margaret's heart lifted as she slit the envelope open with the tip of her finger. Inside was a handwritten note and several neatly folded sheets. When Margaret laid the pages out, she realized they weren't just news. They were a breakdown itemized household expenses, each one carefully noted in Susan's precise handwriting. Electricity, gas, water, approx. US 95, preschool tuition, approx. US 145, groceries, approx. US 60, other miscellaneous expenses, approx. US 40, total, approx. US 440. Below the column of numbers, Susan had written, Mom, if you could help out with maybe $500 a month, it would mean the world to me. Margaret's eyes widened. D? She read the letter all the way through. Then, disbelieving, she turned back to the beginning and read it again. And again. Susan's words weren't cold or curt. They were gentle, careful, and almost apologetic, written in Susan's smallest, neatest script. But still, is this really a request? Or is she just telling me, expecting it naturally, as if I can or should just do this for her now? Margaret folded the letter and slid it into the top drawer of the cherrywood desk in the front room. She pressed her palm over her heart and let out a long, quiet sigh. I thought by now I'd be the one Susan leaned on, the one she admired, not the one supporting her like this. A faint ache spread through the back of Margaret's chest, growing quietly, not sharp but deep, settling in as loneliness. Still, she didn't write a reply, not right away. The next morning, out in the garden patch, her old shovel felt far heavier than usual. Every chore seemed to demand just a bit more strength. Later, Margaret turned the television on, but the news seemed to pass straight through her. Even when she sat before the shelf where Bill's old photos and her mother's locket stood, her simple American version of a family altar, her thoughts felt unmoored, floating somewhere just above her head. That night, Margaret pulled out her diary and pressed pen to page. Each word slow and deliberate. June 7th. Letter from Susan. About money? She's never written to ask before. Is she asking for help, or does she think maybe it's just normal now? I don't know. But, Lord, how my heart aches. When she closed her diary, a cool country breeze made the cotton curtains flutter in the dark. In the fridge were eggplants and bell peppers, picked fresh that very morning, still smelling like soil and sunlight. But more than the gentle ending of Susan's letter was the line that stuck in Margaret's mind. My bank info is at the bottom. It felt heavier and weightier than anything else. How was Susan feeling when she wrote this? Is my daughter truly in trouble? Does she need me? If she does, should I help? Or is that my duty as her mother? Is doing for the same as loving her? Margaret's sleep was restless that night. Flavor to Wericas have been the members to aiding to Mumperans. The whys of abilities. The ticking of the bedroom wall clock impossibly loud in the silence. Days passed, and still she couldn't bring herself to write Susan back. Every evening, as dusk softened the edges of the living room, Margaret's gaze would drift, without meaning to, over to that letter, still sitting there on her desk. She'd sit back, arms folded over her chest, and another sigh would slip out, unbidden. It was nearly 2 weeks later, while Margaret sat beside the back window watching a pair of deer pick through her onions, that a text message pinged her phone. "Mom, did you read my letter? You haven't said anything. Isn't it kinda mean not to answer?" Margaret picked up her old smartphone. She typed, erased, typed again. Her hands shook just a little each time. At last, she set it aside, still unsure what, if anything, she could find the right words to say. "I'm doing all right," Margaret finally typed, her thumb trembling over the touchscreen. "I read your letter, but... The sentence trailed off unfinished. Before she could figure out how to continue, Margaret quietly closed her phone and set it, face down, on the table. There just aren't any words that seem right, past boot. Maybe it was because she didn't want it to sound like an excuse. Or maybe, deep inside, she simply hadn't worked up the courage to step over that final, invisible line that separates who she'd always been as a mother from what her daughter seemed to want now. A month passed. Then another envelope, a crisp, white one, appeared in Margaret's battered mailbox. The sender was, once again, Susan. Margaret slipped off her gardening gloves and sat slowly down at the kitchen table, the mid-morning sun catching a line of dust on the old tile countertop. She turned the envelope over in her hands for a moment, then opened it with a careful, practiced slit. Inside was a legal form, a power of attorney, drawn up so that a portion of Margaret's Social Security check, about $400 each month, could be wired directly to Susan's account, automatically. Susan had already filled out all the important information. The return address, routing numbers, the request for monthly transfer. All that remained was Margaret's signature and an official stamp from the bank. Margaret's fingertips trembled as she grasped the document. So this is how it happens. Even if I say nothing, things roll forward. She left the document lying exactly where it was, at the center of the table, while she started in on dinner, the way she always did, moving methodically from one quiet kitchen task to another. Water ran from the tap with its usual gentle clatter. Her favorite knife thudded softly against the wood of the cutting board. But all these familiar kitchen sounds felt strange and distant, as if she were listening to her own life through a thick pane of glass. Her hand shook as she washed potatoes. When she reached for the peeler, she nicked her finger, a thin line of blood blooming at the tip. "Oh dear." Margaret bandaged the cut, moving slowly. Where did I go wrong? She wondered in the quiet of her mind. She remembered those hard years. The fall. Susan finished high school and nearly gave up on going any further, because the money wasn't there. Margaret remembered saying, "If you want this, I'll find a way. I'll take care of the tuition somehow." And she did it, dipping into savings, working nights at the local diner to scrape together what Susan needed. She could still see Susan's face in her memory, tear-streaked and earnest. "Mom, I promise I'll pay you back. I'll make you proud. You won't ever have to worry again." And now, what had that come to? Now it had become, with the stroke of a pen and the click of a button, support on autopilot. A monthly transaction handled by paperwork. Susan must have her reasons. Maybe things really are hard for her now, but still. That night, after the dishes were washed and the house lay silent, Margaret sat at her old writing desk and opened her diary. March 5th. The power of attorney form arrived today. I don't know if she's even waiting for my answer anymore. Maybe she thinks it's only natural for a mother to help out like this, but I don't want to become just an ATM, not yet. Not ever, if I can help it. Outside her kitchen window, the autumn breeze rattled the old oak branches and whisked brown leaves against the porch rail. The sound seemed to fill Margaret's heart with a chill, hollow space. The next afternoon, the phone rang again. Susan. Once, twice, 3 times, 4. Margaret stared at the name flashing on the screen, but couldn't bring herself to answer. She listened to the insistent ring until it died away, leaving only the hush of the old farmhouse. Moments later, a new message appeared. "Mom, how long are you going to ignore me? I'm doing the best I can. I just Need your help. Margaret closed her eyes. You're doing your best, you say. But so have I, all these years. The difference is, I never knew how to shout about it, not even when it hurt most. The words caught at the back of her throat, never making it out. Instead, all she could do was tuck them deeper inside, where the ache slowly gathered. Late one chilly October evening, while storm clouds pressed low over the Vermont hills, Margaret moved swiftly across the back porch, pulling in the last of the laundry. The wind was sharp, cracking like distant ice, one of those nights where you could feel winter waiting just beyond the edge of dusk. She set down the basket and, as she reached for the light switch, her smartphone buzzed once, Susan's name glowing on the lock screen. Margaret hesitated only a second, then slid her finger across the glass. Mom? Yes, honey, what is it? For a moment, everything hung in the air, all the unsaid things, all the lines that had stretched and frayed between them. Then, Susan's voice flowed out, hot and pleading, as if she'd simply been waiting for that single word of welcome. Mom, I really can't anymore. I'm at my limit. Ever since Michael quit his job, it's all fallen on me. I'm paying for daycare, covering the mortgage, groceries, everything. I just can't carry it all by myself anymore. Margaret listened in silence, her breath held, words lost before they reached her lips. And you? Susan's voice cracked a little, angry and desperate all at once. You don't even answer my texts, or pick up when I call. What are you thinking? We're family. I'm your daughter. Doesn't that matter to you? Margaret's hand on the phone trembled ever so slightly, almost unnoticeable. But what struck her most wasn't the force of Susan's words. It was the trembling, urgency beneath them, a deep, raw need. Please, Mom, please. Just help us get by. $500 a month. It's not impossible, right? You get Social Security. Can't you spare that much at least? The line fell silent, filled with nothing but the faint hum between two lives a long way apart. Then, slowly, Margaret found her voice. It's not impossible, she said very quietly. Then. But, Margaret cut in, the steady calm in her voice stopping Susan cold. With that single word, everything stilled on the other end of the call. Only quiet, heavy promise hanging in the space between them. But Susan, those $500? That's money I finally managed to put aside. For myself. For the very first time, after all these years, there was no reply. The silence deepened. Then Susan asked, the edge gone from her tone, almost pleading. I've worked for you, Susan. Always. Day and night, doing cafeteria shifts, cleaning rooms at the senior center after hours, picking up whatever work I could. I promised myself I'd never cut corners for your education. Never. Margaret's words weren't angry. Her voice was as soft as the Vermont wind at dusk, but each one rang out with feeling that went straight to the core, simple, certain, and a little weary. Now I want, just for once, to take care of my own needs too, even if it's just a little. I hope you can let me have that. There was a long, aching pause. Then, Susan's voice hardened suddenly, losing all gentleness. So what, you're only thinking of yourself now? She hissed. If that's how it sounds, then so be it, Margaret answered quietly. You're supposed to be my mother. You don't even care how I'm feeling, do you? You're wrong, Margaret said, soft but steady. She took a breath, then spoke her next words more firmly than she ever had in her life. Susan, it's because I'm your mother that I don't want you to depend on me. I want you to stand on your own. That's what love is. Because I love you, I can't just make you lean on me for the rest of your life. The words seemed to echo across the line, so sharp and unexpected that Margaret almost thought she could hear Susan gasp, a quiet gasp that said more than any argument could. But Susan's anger swept back in an instant. Fine. Just forget it. Don't ever contact me again. Click. The call went dead. In the sudden hush by Margaret's ear, a silence heavier than any shouting filled the house. It seemed to echo off the walls, down the empty hallway into every inch of the night. For a long, long moment, Margaret didn't move. She simply stood holding the silent phone, her eyes fixed on the faded wallpaper, the shadows growing longer in the failing light. Slowly, she set her old smartphone down on the table, face down. That night, Margaret didn't finish making dinner. She left half-chopped carrots on the old cutting board, letting the cool air settle all around her. She crossed the living room to the antique stove and coaxed it back to life, huddling close for warmth. From her purse, Margaret drew out the document Susan had sent the power of. Attorney for transferring her Social Security payments. Susan had written her mother's name and address so carefully, the letters precise and loving, as if every detail might help ease the ask. Margaret folded the document, slow and small, making each crease neat and even. Quietly, she slipped it into the stove's soft orange flames. She listened for the soft crackle of burning paper, watched the white-gray ash rise and scatter in the faint draft near her feet. She shut her eyes and whispered, "I'm sorry, but please, just let me have this one thing. Fee, just this, forgive me." She placed her hands on her knees, quietly, as if in prayer, and sat very still. Outside, the wind in the tall pines swept through the yard, brushing bare maple branches against the side of the house. The sound wrapped gently around the little room, like a blanket Margaret didn't know she needed. After Susan's call ended, Margaret never heard from her again. No letters, no texts, not even a missed call in months. Her daughter had vanished from her daily life, leaving nothing but a hollow ache and the memory of her voice. That winter came early, harsher than most. Heavy snowdrifts built up around the old Vermont farmhouse. But Margaret rose with the sun every morning, just as she always had. She watched the world outside turn white and silent through frosty panes while, sipping her morning tea, the warm mug between her hands and the radio playing old country tunes low in the background. Neighbors, now and then, stopped by to drop off pickled beets or help shovel snow from the drive. Folks chatted on the porch, swapping recipes, trading home-sewn mittens for a jar of preserves, lending a hand here and there but never prying too deeply. Margaret's days stretched out quietly, sometimes lonely, but always touched by simple kindness. And whether her heart ached or her hands stiffened with age, Margaret found a certain peace in that steady, ordinary rhythm. One where love was sometimes letting go, and sometimes waiting in silence, trusting that the roots you've set down will hold, even beneath a drift of cold Vermont snow. One chilly afternoon, Margaret Anderson settled herself down on the worn couch in her Vermont farmhouse, the sky outside darkening with heavy winter clouds. From one of the upstairs closets, she pulled out a faded cardboard box filled with old wool. The yarn, soft and uneven with age, brought back memories of years past, bits saved from countless projects, left behind after Susan outgrew her scarves and mittens. Margaret sat quietly, spreading out the colors on her lap, pale blue, forest green, wheat gold. Then, setting her jaw with gentle determination, she began to knit, first a tiny sweater, then a pair of mittens, each one small enough to fit an infant or toddler. Her hands, stiff from years of garden work and cold weather, sometimes fumbled over the stitches, but the gentle, familiar motion began to warm her fingers. These gifts weren't for Susan's little boy. Margaret had a different, quieter purpose in mind. Across the narrow country road lived Julia Matthews, a young mother whose husband died only a few months before in a sudden car accident. Julia now juggled a part-time supermarket job and raising her baby girl alone. When Julia needed to run errands or simply catch her breath at the grocery store, Margaret would watch little Emily for an hour, gently bouncing and rocking her, singing the old lullabies she still remembered. To be honest, Margaret confided one day to a neighbor over coffee, "I don't need to be anyone's mother anymore. But if my hands can be useful for someone else, even just for a little while, I think that's enough." The needles clicked and paused, each row measured and neat, the rhythm steady even as the wind whistled down from the hills, rattling the old window panes. One late afternoon, when the sky hung thick with promise of more snow, a group of students from the nearby state college stopped by Margaret's front door. Their professor had sent them out to interview older adults living alone in rural Vermont as part of a community sociology project. The students tried their best to look composed as they introduced themselves in the chilly entryway, voices a little nervous. notebooks in shaking hands. "Thank you so much for speaking with us, Mrs. Pryking Anderson," said one, a tall young man with anxious eyes. "If it's okay, we'd like to ask you a few questions right away. We've been hearing from a lot of our classmates that young folks are feeling pressure taking care of their parents, sending money, sometimes even worrying they have to look after everything. But from a parent's perspective, how do you see all that? What do you think about it?" Margaret blinked, genuinely surprised at the question. But her lips curved into an understanding smile as she nodded. She set aside her mug of tea on the side table, wrapping her hands together for warmth. "Well, I'll say this. These days, life's not easy for young people. Prices keep going up, wages don't always cover what they used to, and finding steady work can be a real struggle," she began. Her voice held steady but kind, and the students all leaned in, eager not to miss a single word. The gentlest hush fell over the small living room, where the fading winter light painted long shadows across the floorboards. "But, my generation, we grew up with something passed down, something that said, don't complain. Don't ask for help, even when it hurts. And we learned that putting up with hardship was kind of, well, a virtue. You managed, you kept it to yourself, and you didn't burden your family with your worries." She let her words hang for a moment. The students scribbled in their notebooks, lips pressed tight in thought. Margaret glanced out the window as a swirl of snowflakes started to float by, inching higher against the porch rail. "That's why, sometimes, folks like me end up helping or just quietly doing, without ever saying a word. It gets to be a habit keeping silent, always trying to support someone else. But after a while you realize, that can backfire. If you always do everything for your children, without asking anything in return, sometimes it doesn't teach them how to stand on their own. It can make them feel like they have to lean on you, whether they want to or not." A hush settled over the group then, until one student raised her hand, hesitant. "Does that mean a parent shouldn't help their child out?" Margaret shook her head, soft as a feather, and her eyes crinkled at the corners. "No, honey, that's not what I mean. Helping isn't wrong, and doing what you can for your family isn't either." She glanced down at the basket of knitting in her lap, each loop and fiber held the story of her own heart. But love doesn't mean you have to give up every last piece of who you are. It doesn't always mean giving everything you've saved or giving up your own peace. It's about finding a balance. Helping, yes, but letting your child learn how to walk on their own too. Outside, the snow thickened, falling softly over the field and the silent, dark trees. It kept coming, soft and relentless, piling quietly on the rooftop. Parents want to be there for their children, right up to the very end, Margaret continued, her voice almost a whisper in the hush of the room. But you need to keep one part of yourself, your own backbone, strong inside. If you don't, if you give away every last scrap of yourself, what happens if your child falters? If you fall apart too, then nobody can get back up again. A gentle awe filled the living room, the students' pencils stilling as they pressed those words into memory. Quiet minutes passed. Then, a young woman near the back spoke up, her voice so soft it nearly broke. "My mom's just like that. She's always done things for me, without complaining, without asking for anything. I think I need to go home tonight and just say, thank you. Really say it." Margaret nodded, her smile warming the room. "That's the very best thing you can do for her," she answered, voice gentle as the snow laying itself down outside. By the time the interview ended, it was dusk. The students thanked Margaret, each in their own way, bowing their heads as they left, pulling up their scarves and stepping back out into the cold blue evening. Margaret watched them from her front step for a moment, their laughter and quick footsteps fading down the frozen lane. She wrapped her arms around herself and murmured, just for her own ears, being a parent, it isn't only about giving things. Sometimes, it's about supporting from a quiet distance, giving your child the space and strength to stand tall. Inside, only the soft humming of the radiator stayed behind, and the faint rustle of the wind wound its way under the eaves. Then came spring. Harsh gray days melted away. and the shadows on the hills outside Ellenburg faded under the first golden rays of sun. On one sweet, warming day, at last, Margaret Anderson opened her mailbox to find a single envelope, a new invitation, waiting patiently in her trembling hands. It was an early spring morning at the Pineview Community Center, where neighbors and local university students had gathered for a special public forum, a collaboration between the center and Pineview State College located just outside Albany, New York. The theme, parent-child relationships and the boundaries of love. Over the past few years, trouble with adult children relying on their parents for money, extended care, or emotional support problems of remittance, caregiving, and dependence had begun to surface in the community, echoing national concerns. The event promised to be more than just a panel. It was meant as a space to reflect, for parents, grown children, and caregivers alike. Among the speakers that day was Margaret Anderson, invited specifically to share her perspective in a session titled, "What Elderly Parents Really Feel." Word had spread about Margaret's thoughtful ways. She was known for her wisdom and grace, having lived in the community for decades, her quiet strength never wavering. On the day of the event, the community center's event hall was already nearly full as the clock struck 10. Couples in their 70s found seats together, mothers with newborns gathered near the aisle, and young men and women in hoodies, students lined the back rows, notebooks ready. Every seat, it seemed, was filled with someone whose life had felt the gentle but unyielding tug of family. After a brief welcome, the host introduced Margaret. She stood up slowly, clutching the microphone in both hands. Though she was small and wore a pale cream cardigan over a flowered blouse, Margaret's presence was unmistakable. There was a calmness to her, the kind forged across long seasons of loss, hard work, and resilience. "I'm not a special person," Margaret began, her voice steady, reaching the far corners of the room. "I'm just a mother, like so many others here. That's why I chose to speak today." The crowd quieted, all ears, as Margaret continued. "It's natural to want to help your child when they're struggling. If they come to you needing money, time, support, your heart just aches to make things better. That's what it means to be a parent, isn't it?" Head after head nodded in understanding. Several students looked down, pens poised to write, as if the words held secrets for their own families. "But I learned," Margaret went on, "that love doesn't just mean giving everything you have. Sometimes, to protect your child's future, you have to have the courage not to give. At least not in the ways they expect. That can be harder than opening your wallet or rushing in to help." There was a hush. Margaret's voice, never loud, nonetheless filled the space with certainty. "I almost erased myself once. I wondered if I hadn't done enough as a mother. If maybe I'd failed somehow by setting boundaries or holding some things back," she admitted. "But then I realized, if you can't take care of yourself, you can't truly support anyone else. Not really." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. From across the room came the soft sound of someone sniffling. Near the front, a young mother with a sleeping infant wiped silent tears from her cheeks, her shoulders rising and falling with quiet emotion. After a long moment, she spoke. Her voice trembled, "I think I've relied on my mom too much. I always thought she'd take care of everything. When I get home, I'm going to call her and tell her I'm sorry." Margaret smiled gently and bowed her head. "Sometimes love is turning away," she replied softly. "Because you trust the person you love to grow strong, you choose not to step in. Sitting back and watching, quietly believing in them, that too is love." Margaret brought her talk to a close. To be loved isn't just to be taken care of. It's to grow into the kind of person who can support another, anyone, in any way they can. In that back and forth, both parents and children change. I truly believe that. For a moment, no one moved. A deep silence flowed through the room, marked only by the soft hum of the building's heater. Then, as if waking, the crowd erupted in applause, sincere, lingering, and full of gratitude. And to those listening, Margaret offered one more gentle question. Is there someone in your life, maybe a parent, maybe someone else, enduring quietly, never asking for thanks, simply weathering what comes? Saying nothing does not mean feeling nothing. Even if words never pass between you, those silent acts, the old photo on a mantel, a meal delivered without comment, a steady hand on a shoulder, are proof of a heart that cares. A single letter, a single call, a single thank you has the power to gently melt the ice that can creep into a life, even if only a little at a time. If today's story has touched your heart, even a little, please share that feeling with someone close to you. Pass it on, let the conversation grow. Thank you for being here, for seeing this story through to the end. And if you found yourself nodding along, if something in this story echoed your own life, consider sharing it or pressing like so that others might also pause, just for a moment, and reflect on what it means to be a parent, a child, a family today. May this small moment spark more long conversations about the shape of love within families, across generations, and within yourself. We will continue to bring you stories that touch the heart and light a candle within it. If you enjoyed today's story, we invite you to subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us keep these tales flowing, reaching even more listeners, one gentle moment at a time. We look forward, truly, to the next story. May the day we meet again come soon. From the very bottom of our hearts, thank you for being part of this journey. Your time, your attention, and the simple act of listening mean more than you know. Until we see you again, may the warmth of these stories linger in your days.